All right. How about we get going? Thank you, everybody who's online joining us today. I'm Diane Hirschberg. I'm the director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research here at UAA. Before we jump into today's program, I'd like to acknowledge that ICER's offices and my home are located on the ancestral and unceded traditional lands of the Dena'ina people. I'd like to express my gratefulness for their stewardship of this beautiful place and thank the native village of Eklutna for welcoming us to their lands. Today's topic, explaining the Russia invasion of Ukraine, is important both globally and locally. And we really feel it's important that Alaskans have an opportunity to understand both what is happening to Ukraine and its citizens during this unprovoked invasion, but also what it means to Alaska in terms of impacts here. And this extends to questions about reducing dependence on Russian oil and mineral resources. And we are so pleased that Dr. Chad Briggs has agreed to talk with us today. Dr. Briggs is formerly the director of the graduate studies at UAA's College of Business and Public Policy, but he has also worked with NATO and the Ukrainian Army since 2011 on hybrid and cyber warfare. And he was based in Kosovo and Ukraine for 4 years before moving to Alaska in 2019. There is going to be some time for questions after Dr. Briggs is done speaking, and we do request that you enter your questions into the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. You should see a place where you can click on Q&A and write in your questions there, and hopefully we can get through them all. But for now, again, I'm really pleased to turn this over to Dr. Chad Briggs.
Thank you, Diane. I really appreciate being able to come here, and well, I'm still in Anchorage. Yes, I have left UAA and I'm working on contract for the US government right now. So I need to give the standard disclaimer that everything I'm saying is in my capacity as a researcher. I'm still working with ICER as a researcher on National Science Foundation projects, and I'm a faculty at Johns Hopkins University. So nothing I say represents policies of the US government. And I say this also because I want to be clear, if I do get any questions about what should the US policy toward Russia and Ukraine be, then I might have to be a little circumspect. What I give in answers here in a webinar, which will also be posted on YouTube, is probably different than what I would tell people privately over drinks. So I just want to start by trying to explain that my background, yes, I did come to Alaska by way of Kosovo and Ukraine. It wasn't really a typical destination from those places, but there are connections, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine does reverberate pretty strongly in terms of what happens here in Alaska, what happens in the United States, and the feelings that people have when they see these images on TV. So I want to try to give some explanation of what has happened, at least from the perspective of people in Ukraine and from the perspective of people who watch Russia for a long time. And also to frame it in terms of, this is not a Ukraine crisis, right? This is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So even though this is sometimes portrayed in the media in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, then really we have to focus in large part upon actions by the Kremlin. I do want to start with just a little bit of historical perspective on things. And first of all, by admitting my own historical perspective. I started, as Dr. Hirschberg had mentioned, with the US Air Force assignment to Ukraine in 2011. And after this, when I was working more in a civilian role, this had to do with some of my colleagues in Ukraine, particularly people like Tatiana Malerenko, who had been warning even 11 years ago about impending potential violent conflict in Ukraine. And we worked together to bring in NATO and European Union funding to try and help train Ukrainian security experts on ideas of irregular warfare, hybrid warfare, cyber, so forth. And well, really the events of 2014 got in the way, meaning I was supposed to be in Crimea in the spring of 2014, but the Russians beat us there. But I continued working with them and then with the Ukrainian army. But I need to point out this was not done on contract. I wasn't just some sort of high-flying mercenary. In large part, this was just an extension of my university work or I was simply working as a volunteer. But from the perspective, we need to think of Ukraine as a distinct entity, meaning even though Vladimir Putin had pointed out or made an argument that Ukraine doesn't really exist outside of Russia, this really isn't true. This would be in many ways like saying that, well, because Alaska had been colonized by Russia, Alaska doesn't really have an identity of its own. It does. And going back to the centuries, of course, the borders have changed. There have been different identities. There are different languages that are spoken in different areas. But there is still a very distinctive identity with regards to Ukraine. Now, even though in, say, 2014 or 2013, there was a great deal of division in the country in terms of what direction Ukraine should take in the future. Should they look east and retain some of their traditional ties that they'd had with Moscow, or should they look further to the west? Now, Ukraine did receive its independence in late 1991, early 1992, and it has been an independent country since then. The developments that we've seen since 2013, however, have been in large part a resurgence not of identity that's happened in Ukraine. That has changed, but what was more important was the nationalism in the Kremlin, meaning Vladimir Putin had started to argue that there was this old idea, really it existed in centuries before, but he dug it back out and dusted it off and said that it had always been true, this idea of Novorossiya, the idea that there was this broader Russia that existed, and in particular that existed in southern Ukraine, that went from, say, southern Russia, and this is the area around Sochi, through Crimea, cities like Odessa, and then into Moldova. And then this was justification for an annexation of Crimea, which took place in 2014. In large part, this was Russia, meaning the Russian government, reacting in very conservative and, shall we say, Russian nationalism terms, of being afraid which direction Ukraine was taking. From the perspective of an autocrat in the Kremlin, it would be very, very destabilizing if they would say that, well, yes, Ukraine is very much like Russia, but look, they have a very functioning democracy, whereas here in Russia, we don't. So the perspective of the Kremlin was then to destabilize Ukraine as much as possible. This is a very different type of warfare, meaning this isn't the sort of Napoleonic code where you see the armies would go in and occupy a territory and then would annex it. That did happen in Crimea, but what happened in places like Donbass in eastern Ukraine was instead to simply destabilize the existing order, to delegitimize the leaders in Kiev, to say that you can't trust that country, there's too much corruption, there's too much uncertainty. And we could see that happening over the years. There were large numbers of cyber attacks that took place on the country. There were economic attacks. There were, even in the run-up to the invasion that we saw exactly a month ago, we saw Western companies pulling out. We saw that air travel to Kiev and other parts of Ukraine were being shut off because the insurance wouldn't underwrite it. It was too unstable. That was deliberate, that was intentional. And it was meant to simply mean that no Westerners could really get a foothold there, because anytime that they would go and say, well, yes, we want to partner with Ukraine, they would say, well, actually, we're not exactly sure who to trust. But this all changed about a month ago, well, exactly a month ago, when there was a large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces. It is interesting because many people, myself included, didn't expect such a large-scale invasion. There were people in the US intelligence community who were warning about this. And very notably, the US embassy in Kiev was relocated to Lviv in Western Ukraine. And then just before the invasion, were relocated to Poland in its entirety. And many of the European capitals didn't believe that this was happening. And I can say, because this is based on information that I've received from my research colleagues in Ukraine, so we want to publish this sometimes, this isn't a secret. They said that even the Ukrainian military really didn't expect some sort of large-scale invasion, in large part because one, this was a shift from these previous destabilization efforts. Although invading a country, of course, is very destabilizing, this goes against the so-called Germasov doctrine or maskirovka, which had been practiced by Russia for so many years. Maskirovka, which literally means masking, was a practice by which Russia would undertake actions to destabilize Ukraine, but would never take responsibility for it. They would never admit that it was them who were doing it. This created the so-called little green men euphemism, because when paratroopers came into Crimea in 2014, Russia for many weeks didn't admit that these were Russian forces, even though they were wearing Russian uniforms, but they had the insignia taken off. So everyone would say, no, 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 it's not Russia, it's not Russia. And when Russian forces were seen in Donbass, in Eastern Ukraine later in 2014, again, they would say, no, those aren't Russian forces. So even when journalists would use facial recognition to point out from social media that, hey, this is a Russian troop who 2 weeks ago was in the Far East in a Russian tank corps, and now he's in Ukraine, the official response from Moscow was, oh, well, they were tourists, they got lost. And with cyber efforts as well, even though many of you might have heard of the Internet Research Agency, which was groups of cyber jockeys who were working just off of Red Square or in St. Petersburg, most of the Russian cyber efforts were undertaken by mercenaries. In other words, they were third parties who would be licensed or coerced into working for Russia, but it was always a way for them to say, whether it was the GRU or the SVR or the FSB, the Russian intelligence agencies, for them to say, well, no, it wasn't us. So for Russia to very, very visibly invade another country, and in ways that, no one could deny that it was Russia doing it, even though, for example, the foreign minister Lavrov would go to negotiations in Turkey and then would say, no, 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 we have no Russian troops in Ukraine, but you should surrender to us quickly. But in large part, this was based upon expectations that this war would be very short and very sharp. In other words, this was a blitzkrieg strategy where it would only take maybe 48 hours for troops to reach Kiev. And then from there, they would destabilize, they would topple the government. Zelensky might escape and go into hiding somewhere in the West. And then Russia would install a new leader. This didn't happen, though. In large part, it didn't happen. Well, I won't go into all the military details because that's not exactly my area of expertise. But in large part, it happened because the Ukrainian military of 2022 is not the Ukrainian military that the Russians met in 2014. They've been much more trained, including by the US, countries like Canada. They're better armed. And there's more of a sense that this war has been going on for the past 8 years, so they've been toughened up in terms of the resolve of not wanting Russia to be able to take over the government, not being able to let them win. And even though there were Russian expectations that Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv or Odessa would simply easily fall, would go over to Russia, this hasn't been the case. There's been much more solidification of Ukrainian identity. The leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky has been admirable. It's used all of the lessons of information warfare. So not simply saying that he's going to stay in Kiev and carry on the fight, but being very proactive in terms of sharing images, sharing the speeches, being there in terms of Western governments and Western audiences, so that everyone can really see this is the human face of the Ukrainian government. It was also the case that the Russian military overextended their supply lines. They were only able to operate along roadways. This made them very vulnerable. They didn't capture cities as they went along. And so after they'd go through a city, then Ukrainian territorial forces would set up defensive nodes and essentially cut off the supply lines. And this is why when in past weeks you'd heard about this convoy that was north of Kiev and was simply stretched some, say, 30 miles along the road, that wasn't an invasion force so much as everyone had run out of gas. And if you go onto Twitter, you can find all sorts of really interesting rabbit holes to fall into in terms of military logistics and military maintenance and so forth, things that Russia just didn't do properly. What's really important now, though, is the idea of Western assistance. Zelensky, when he addressed the NATO summit this morning, was emphasizing this once again. And what form of assistance this takes, that's not something that's really up to me to say, this is the one best course of action. But what I can say is that whatever the course of action, it needs to be and needs to remain unified, in large part because if you have something like sanctions, for example, the enormity of the sanctions, the strength of the sanctions that have been placed against the Russian government really did surprise the Kremlin. One of the aspects of Maskirovka is to always operate underneath the threshold of concerted response, meaning that if you're fighting NATO, make sure that you keep it under Article 5 considerations so that NATO won't say, oh yes, this is an attack upon NATO. Instead, they'll do things that, say in the cyber realm, they're not really sure exactly where that falls in terms of appropriate response, but they didn't expect that all of the European Union countries, all of the NATO countries would really hold together and then just say, no, we're going to cut you off from the international system. And we're going to cut you off from social media. We're essentially cutting them out of any sort of benefit they would have had from being part of international order. I do want to show just this video quickly because this kind of shows the scale of the destruction that is being visited upon Ukraine. And even though we see this in terms of short clips, keep in mind this city, Mariupol, which is on the Sea of Azov, this was supposedly a friendly city for the Russians, meaning they originally in their strategic documents had expected they could roll into cities like this and meet no resistance. But because they met such stiff resistance, because they weren't able to take these cities, they've resorted back to either Chechen or Syrian responses, which is to say that they're simply going to raze the city to the ground then. So this is a city larger than Anchorage, say about the size of Minneapolis. 80% of the buildings in the city have now been destroyed, and there isn't a single building in the city that isn't damaged. So even though there are comparisons that are made to the war in Syria in which Russia has been involved, the intensity of the bombardment has been really off the scale compared to what has been experienced there. And really, you'd have to go back to what happened to cities like Grozny in, say, 1999, 2000 to see the extent of the damage. And this means that the attacks on civilians are deliberate. The forced relocation of people, whether inside Ukraine or to other countries, is also deliberate. This has traditionally been part of the Russian military playbook. Now, I say this partly because we ran, meaning this was an EU-sponsored event, we ran in Kiev in 2017, where we modeled essentially this exact scenario, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And by the way, I did write about this in the book, so none of this is secret either. But what I can say is that I was surprised. I was surprised at, and pleasantly, positively surprised at the Ukrainian response, meaning that the strength of the response, the capabilities of the Ukrainian army, the resolve also not just within Ukraine, but the resolve of NATO, of the European Union, of these organizations in Brussels, was markedly different from what we wargamed, say, about 5 years ago. But the one thing which is similar is the creation of refugees. So the millions of people, and currently it's somewhere over 3 million, who've left Ukraine and have gone into other countries, most into Poland, but if you think proportionally, then the say 400,000 that have gone into Moldova is a staggering number. Moldova is a very small country, it's not rich. And for all of these countries to welcome in these refugees, and then this morning, President Biden had said that the US will begin to take in about 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. This is very important. And it's important because as part of the Russian playbook, this is meant to divide the allies. That just like Europe had experienced a refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, numbers nothing like this, right? But because of perhaps where people came from, or because it was proportionally placed upon certain countries like Greece, this created something of a political crisis within the European Union. We've not seen the same sort of response here. But I will say that there is compassion fatigue that's possible. meaning that to host 2 million or 500,000 people in your country is possible in the short term. But if this drags out, if the people aren't able to return to their homes, aren't able to go back to Ukraine, or have nothing to go back to within Ukraine, and within Ukraine itself, there are many millions more who've been displaced. And I should also point out that Ukraine is a large country. Now, it may be less than half the size of Alaska, but that's still incredibly large by European terms. And there are 44 million people, pre-war population of Ukraine. So this is a very large country. And the displacement of so many people, while it's meant to divide the Allies, one of the biggest efforts that I know people in Washington, D.C. or in Brussels are attempting to do is to keep that sort of Allied resolve so that they don't start squabbling among one another. They don't fall back and say, no, we're not going to have sanctions anymore. This is too costly. And instead, just to show a sort of unified response. And that was really, I think, the intention of really pretty extraordinary this morning to see both a NATO summit and a G7 summit at the same time. But I will also mention, because this is probably of interest to people in Alaska, the energy issue. Russia has traditionally been an exporter of oil and gas to Western Europe. This is nothing new. And I will, on one of my last slides, I'll give a couple, because I still have to act like a professor, I'll give reading assignments for everyone. One of them is a recent New York Times article, which shows how Ronald Reagan really tried to stop these pipelines, say about 40 years ago, because he felt that it was a strategic blunder, that this would cause too much dependence of countries on Russian oil and gas, back then Soviet oil and gas. And what we see now is really a overnight change in a lot of European defense thinking, meaning that I can say we would have discussions with people in Berlin on Thursday, and then by Sunday morning, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, would come on and then suddenly said something that was completely different from what we'd heard, meaning greater investment in defense spending. So for many years, Obama and Trump had said that all these countries need to get up to about 2% GDP in terms of NATO defense spending. That's probably going to happen now. It never would have occurred before this, but I think there's so much realization now that, wow, these security issues are real. They're right on our doorstep, and they're really pretty scary. We see increasingly Norway and Sweden moving potentially towards NATO membership, even though these have traditionally been neutral countries. But the energy question is still a lingering one, meaning even though the European Union came out with a new energy strategy, this was about 2 weeks ago, in which they lay out how they're going to get off Russian oil and gas well before, quote unquote, well before 2030. This still leaves a lot of time for, how do you sanction, how do you cut off oil and gas if so much of your country is dependent upon it? Now, as this map shows, Germany takes really the lion's share of a lot of the Russian gas. And many of you would have heard of Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2, as the number implies, is really the second. There's already a Nord Stream pipeline that goes through the North Sea, sorry, not the North Sea, Baltic Sea, so around the Baltic countries into Germany. And the completion of the second one was really meant to bypass all of the pipelines that have been cut off, which traditionally had gone through Ukraine and then had been shut off after the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Now, what some people have pointed out, however, is that you can look at this in a couple of different perspectives. One, you can look at this in terms of, hey, we need to ramp up our traditional oil and gas and perhaps get back to coal, get back to nuclear. Or alternatively, you can say this is not just an opportunity, but a necessary step that we need to take in order to move to renewable energy technologies. In large part because then we're not dependent upon anyone else, that we can set up our own grids, we can set up our own technologies, and that's greater energy security. So depending upon what the definition of energy security is, then people can go in different directions in terms of policy. I will say, however, that take Germany, 10% of its total energy use comes from Russian gas right now. Now, the question is, well, how do you overnight just cut off that amount of energy use? And one of my colleagues, I guess I can call him by name, Gernot Wagner from NYU, had pointed out that, no, actually, what you can do is cut it off overnight, because we have done it. If you look at countries like Italy in response to the pandemic, yes, it was sharp. Yes, it hurt a lot of people economically, but Italy cut 20% of its energy use overnight in 2020 when it had to respond to the pandemic. So it is possible. You can do simple things like there's so much work, telework that's going on. I mean, I'm still in my house here, that there are many office buildings where they still keep the heat on, where they still keep it up to sort of room temperature levels. And a lot of calculations you can do about, well, if you just maintain a lot of the pandemic response in terms of work from home, flexible work, not having to force people to come in to commute, if you simply take certain measures, then you can immediately start cutting back on oil and gas, which in fact are necessary because gas prices have really shot through the roof even before the war. Even before the invasion, 1 month ago, Russia was holding back many of its oil reserves, and especially its gas reserves to Western Europe. And this was simply to sort of tighten the screws on Western leaders. So there are things that are possible. It just has to do with how do you think of things. Now, with regards to Alaska in particular, and I can answer this more in sort of Q&A, there was for a short time Russian oil imports into the Western refineries, which are the destinations for what comes out of Prudhoe Bay and then Valdez. But that had pretty much already stopped. So if the US is saying that we're going to sanction and we're not going to buy Russian oil, at least in terms of West Coast and in terms of Alaska oil prices, it doesn't really have much of an impact. It can bring up questions about Alaska LNG investments, but and again, I can go more into that in terms of Q&A. And I don't want people pointing figures and saying, well, you know, Chad said we can't do LNG. Let me just say that at least as having led environment and energy research for the Air Force, when we did a large report for the Chief of Staff in 2012, so pretty much 10 years ago, and we got a lot of it wrong. It wasn't because we didn't know what we were talking about. It's just that we didn't take into account a lot of the other geopolitical factors. And in particular, we didn't take into account Chinese investment in renewable energy technologies, which simply sent the prices through the floor. And it meant that even though we were expecting continuation of 2008 era oil prices, that didn't happen, right? And which is why when I showed up in 2019, you know, Alaska didn't have these sort of comfortably high oil prices. So essentially, I'm saying that for people in Alaska or for people in the United States in general, this will have a big impact on global energy and discussions of energy security. But just to point out that there are different definitions of what energy security are. There are about 8 different definitions. Each country can look at things differently. Each commercial sector and government sector can see things differently. And we have to be really creative. We can't simply look and say, well, this has worked for about 20 years in the past. Let's keep doing this then. The whole Russia invasion kind of forces us, both in terms of defense spending, in terms of defensive posture, in terms of energy security, in terms of many different issues, to really rethink what we've thought of as, you know, how does the world work? Even before the invasion, a couple days before the invasion, Putin was giving a speech. It's a rather odd hour-long rambling speech, but he essentially threw out much of the post-Cold War and even the Cold War world order, meaning that if you look back into the 1970s and US-Soviet relations back then, ideas of the Helsinki Final Act, which essentially codified that the borders as they exist now will continue to exist. You can't change national borders. Maybe you can have a country, you know, like Estonia, which can break off from the Soviet Union and then assert its independence, but those Estonian borders still stayed, meaning you can't go back and simply have this sort of revanchism. And the US was very much in support of these ideas, not just with regards to Russia, but even with regards to NATO countries. If there were new NATO entrants from Southeastern Europe, the US was always very clear. It's like, we are not going to talk about whatever borders existed back in 1914. We're stuck with them, and we're going to stay with them. And that gave rise to organizations like the CSCE, which became the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has played a fairly quiet, I think for most Americans, but vital role in terms of peacekeeping and monitoring, including for the Ukraine conflict since 2014. And the Russian government has essentially now said, no, none of that applies anymore. It's just going to be whatever we say, whatever we can do. And that really requires a lot of rethinking of, well, what does the new world order look like? And how do we construct it? How do we create some sort of security guarantees for our allies, for our friends, for our partners? And how do we stop from the really scary sort of escalations that, of course, I can also address questions about weapons of mass destruction. Not my favorite topic because it's stuff I studied in the early 90s and we're supposed to have been done with it. But how do you give security guarantees to countries and not simply give them incentives to say, well, fine, go out and get your own nukes then, because that seems to be the only thing that can prevent a country from being invaded. So I do want to sort of wrap it up there and turn it over to questions. And of course, if we don't get a lot of questions, I can keep rambling on about information warfare and cyber warfare. But I will leave this up for just a little bit in terms of suggestions for some sort of background reading, including from my colleagues, Dr. Melerenko, or if you want some sort of idea on how to help out with refugees. I know that UAA has already had some discussion about that. I wasn't part of that discussion, but what would it take to bring Ukrainian refugees here to Alaska? Because we already have populations, I think, up in the Matsu. But Diane, I'd like to turn it back over to you, and I'd like to thank everyone at least for paying attention to just a quick overview of things, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chad. And we do have a couple questions already. The first one is, on February 22nd, Germany halted Nord Stream 2, which was designed to double the flow of Russian gas directly to Germany. So if the war ends in Ukraine with a regime change in Russia, very hypothetical, could the Nord Stream 2 Baltic Sea gas pipeline project possibly move forward again, perhaps unsanctioned, to contribute to Europe's future energy security?
Yeah, it's kind of a double hypothetical, but yes, it could. The pipeline is essentially built by this point, and it's really only the certification process that's being held up. Now, the certification process meant that once it was held up, then the company that owned it, which was based in Switzerland, went bankrupt pretty much overnight. But the infrastructure is still there. So I think it would be possible. And there always has been kind of an attempted soft approach by German authorities in the past, at least, towards Russia. Gerhard Schroeder, who was the former chancellor, now sits on the board of Rosneft and Gazprom, I believe. So there's always been an attempt to sort of say, well, let's play nice with Russia because we really rely upon them for our energy security. I guess the question would then be, again, what's the definition of energy security? If you're looking at it in terms of, yes, traditional, and maybe there's a new government in Moscow that the West feels that they can trust, then that would be an option. But that's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the stability of the Russian government is. We do know that Putin has surrounded himself by what he considers very trusted people, and then he went and fired about 1,000 of them and replaced them with new staff. Reports are that he's hiding out in a bunker somewhere in the Ural Mountains because he doesn't even feel safe in Moscow. And I suppose if you look at Russian history, that would make sense, right? You don't want to be in the Winter Palace when the peasants show up with their torches and pitchforks. But the sanctions are going to hit the Russians very, very hard. The ruble is essentially worthless now. Imports have been cut off. And I don't mean just the sort of luxury goods, but even staple items like sugar, for example, which I should point out during a lot of Soviet times was always amply available because of trade relations with Cuba. And so symbolically, now there are runs on supermarkets in Moscow. I don't know what's going to happen in in Russia. And even if I knew, even if someone said, yes, Putin's going to be overthrown, I have no idea what that would look like afterwards. And again, if 1917 is any indication, it's not always a very easy road to hoe. What happened in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we lucked out. We lucked out that it wasn't, for the most part, violent, and that I will give a lot of credit to the White House at the time, the Bush administration, and James Baker for navigating those waters. They don't get a lot of credit for that because nothing happened, but that was precisely the point. It's very, very difficult when a large country like that collapses. So it's not something I would, hope on Europe, because that would be a mess. I'm not hoping for, Putin to stay in power either, but it wouldn't be easy in your hypothetical to know who to trust in Moscow if and when the government did fall.
So you answered part of this question, so I'm going to jump down to this because the question was about the effect that sanctions have had both on oligarchs, which you didn't talk as much about, and the Russian economy in general.
The oligarchs, so keep in mind, for those who aren't familiar, the Putin government, even though Vladimir Putin himself was former KGB, he was a KGB colonel who then rose to political prominence in St. Petersburg and then became president after Boris Yeltsin stepped down. This government was always surrounded by, it's essentially a sort of crony capitalism. And so all the people there are fabulously wealthy who surround him. Lavrov, the foreign minister who I'd mentioned earlier, he has a stepdaughter in London, just to give one example. And I put that in quotes because it's not his real wife, it's his sort of second wife. And she, at the age of 21, bought a 4.4 million pound apartment in Kensington in cash. And this was not a civil servant salary, right? So by going after the oligarchs, you're going after the government, right? These are the people who support Putin, who provide his power base, and much of his money lies with other people, not with, there's not like a bunch of bank accounts that have Vladimir Putin's name on them. Rather, they exist in assets overseas. So targeting the oligarchs is important. Some countries are, how do we say politely, less eager to target them because they're friends with them, because they've received contributions from them, because they're, they go to too many parties with them and see them as their friends. And so suddenly to step back as a member of government and say, oh yeah, this person, we need to now sanction them. But you've seen the start. I think the yachts are some of the most visible. These sort of fabulously large, $500 million yachts that are now going towards like Dubai and what they consider to be hopefully safe ports of harbor. There's one that hasn't yet been seized in Norway, I think, but it's effectively seized because no Norwegians are selling it fuel, so it's just sort of stuck in harbor somewhere. But those are things that really do affect the the power brokers. Now, in terms of the individual Russians, this is something that I know the White House was always kind of worried about, meaning they didn't want to just throw on sanctions that would hurt every Russian and hurt them really badly, but it sort of snowballed after the initial sanctions proposals were put out. So these are going to hurt individual Russians. They're going to hurt them pretty badly. A lot of the people who could leave have done so already, meaning there have been a bunch of Russians who've left, and either they've gone to Turkey, Helsinki, Armenia, and I mean, there are a number of countries where Russians who had the ability to do so, ability meaning they had passports, they had some sort of connection there where they're not going to just be met at the airport and shoved back on the plane, and they have the money, because as soon as airspace started getting shut down, then these tickets would be, $1,000 one way from, say, Moscow to Yerevan, where, the week before it would have been $150. So that's left the people who just have to suffer because they must, and that is unfortunate, right? You don't want to just put an embargo on a country and then say, yeah, this is great, because then they're going to get upset and maybe they'll overthrow the government. That's a really harsh playbook, and we don't want to say that, yes, we're targeting the ordinary Russian civilian, because that in some ways it's illegal to do that if it's a direct war embargo, but it's also just not great politics. You want people to sort of come out of this understanding that, yeah, okay, it's them, it's the people in the Kremlin who've done this. And with Navalny in jail, Navalny, he was great at being able to really highlight the corruption of Russian officials, which is why he was, they attempted to assassinate him and then put him in jail. But he famously came out with this video talking about golden toilet brushes in the Kremlin, which really showed the level of corruption, how far out of step they are from the ordinary Russian. And those are the narratives that are more important, I think, rather than Russians actually suffering themselves, because in many ways they have already been suffering from these governments. And I don't know what it's going to look like this summer, this winter. And I will just say that it will affect global agricultural prices. Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat, particularly to countries in the Middle East and Africa. And commodity prices are already spiking in those areas. And that's something I would worry about in terms of spillover effects. So it's not just the Russians who are getting hurt, but this is going to hurt people in other countries as well.
So we're getting a lot of questions. I'm going to start trying to combine a couple of them together.
Okay.
There's different kinds of warfare that seem to be happening right now. There's cyber warfare, and there's also information warfare, including there's a question about Russian citizens, the majority of them supporting the war, and the question of what we're hearing out of Russia as well as what they're hearing from elsewhere. So I'm wondering if you could talk both about what's going on in terms of cyber warfare as well as information warfare.
So for cyber warfare, it's been relatively quiet so far. We saw some run-ups in cyber warfare and activity in Ukraine before February 24th. But the sort of broader attacks that we might have been expecting at least haven't materialized so far. Partly that's because the Western countries have really been ready for this. They were expecting this to happen, and they've been warning not just government agencies, but all sorts of corporations and private entities to get ready. Do your two-factor authentication, change your password, don't go to dodgy internet sites. Of course, that's things you should do all the time. So that hasn't really materialized yet. That's not to say that it won't happen. And there were some new warnings that were put out earlier this week saying that the US government is now seeing increased activity as if they're prepping for something, which might mean attacks on energy infrastructure or, so what we saw last year with Colonial Pipeline, for example, is that could be one of the sort of things that they do. Because that was essentially a Russian attack. It wasn't by the Russian government, but like I said, they worked through mercenaries. So yeah, watch that space. In terms of information warfare, the Ukrainian government, like I said, has been really good at getting ahead of things. I think the US government has also done a really superb job of declassifying intelligence, putting information out there, of essentially stepping ahead of the information curve. Meaning that if there's disinformation, you need to get out ahead of it, and you say, okay, I know that Bill is going to say this, and so when you hear this from Bill, just don't believe it. That's much more effective than Bill telling you something first, and then you coming back and say, oh no, that's not true. That's not true. So it's good to see that they've learned lessons from the past that way. It's also, of course, been the case that Russia has now been cut off of much of social media. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of the sort of Twitter farms or troll farms that we might have found in Russia have now been cut off. And I think that's not what they expected to happen. And even though they do have surrogates in many other countries, including the US, I've seen a downturn at least. Now, that's not to say that information warfare hasn't taken hold in some sectors. There's all sorts of disinformation that's going out about say bioweapons labs or about how Ukraine is full of Nazis. And by the way, none of that's true. And if you want specific debunking, I can give it to you. But for the most part, meaning most of the population, I think they're seeing the Ukrainian face of the war, right? So whatever Russia says is just not really registering, except in a couple select places.
So there's a couple questions that have to do, again, thinking about spillover effects, what this is going to mean for other nations, particularly in Europe. From will Belarus or others join the war, to what may happen in terms of NATO membership when we look at Finland and Sweden and some of the other nations that have stayed out of that.
So with regards to Belarus, now Lukashenko is very close to Putin recently. Not always. They've not always had a great relationship. And there have been some attempts, I think, to provoke Belarus, meaning attempts by Russia to provoke Belarus and then to get involved in the war. For the most part, I don't see that they have much stomach for it. Belarusian army isn't very large. They don't have combat experience as the Russian military does. And they're right next door to Ukraine. It's pretty obvious what they would be doing. And so although they could get involved, you'd probably be seeing potentially mutinies. You'd certainly be seeing Belarusian soldiers just not acting in any sort of, I don't want to say professionalism, but call it that, right? I mean, they're not going to be acting with a whole lot of spirit. But the spillovers could affect, and I see this question come up, about so-called frozen conflicts elsewhere. So whether you're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or the Balkans, we're seeing increased activity in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina. Those are worrying, right? Because those are areas in which, if you knock down enough of the international order, and it's sort of like big countries or bullies can do whatever they want, then that can mean a reignition of formerly frozen conflicts. And having come from Kosovo, that's something that, I would worry about, because it's very easy for those sorts of things to reignite. And we've seen in Sarajevo, the Russian ambassador actually siding and making references back to NATO's intervention in Serbia in 1999, and saying, oh yes, well, this will happen again now in Bosnia, and essentially trying to stir things. Pretty concerted response from European and US diplomats, but again, we can't really tell. So when I can't really tell you what's in all of our briefings in the government, but I can say that yes, we are worried about the Baltics, we're worried about Moldova, worried about Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Central Asian republics, places like Kazakhstan, which we may remember, it seems like ages ago, but Kazakhstan was on fire, just before this all started, but then came back and said, no, we're not going to send troops, even though we have an agreement. We're not sending anyone to Ukraine. So yeah, I would worry about spillovers, but like I said, spillovers can happen outside of the geographic area too. So the Arab Spring was sparked in late 2010 in large part by food riots, and that did have to do with wildfires in Russia and a Russian embargo on wheat, and some sort of cascading issues. So we sort of have to watch all corners.
And then just to add on, the other was that change for Europe in terms of NATO memberships.
Right. So that would apply to countries like I'd mentioned before, countries like Sweden and Finland. Now, Sweden has always been a close partner of NATO, not a member, but a partner, meaning they've trained with NATO, they've worked with NATO. I've worked with the Swedish Defense Forces and defense researchers for years. And that was an introduction through NATO. So they're already probably pretty positively, shall I say, oriented towards, cooperating more with Brussels, whether that means a formal marriage and relationship. That's harder to say. For Finland, this is a pretty quick turnaround. And there is now a majority of the population in Finland, which is in favor of NATO membership. But of course, the government has to take that slowly. They can't just say overnight, yeah, okay, we're going to do this, because that would completely change Finnish defensive orientation ever since 1945. So, but if they see increased threats from Russia, and Russia went back and threatened Sweden and Finland and said, we will, there will be consequences if you join NATO. Even though ironically, that's one of the best reasons to join NATO then, is to have someone to back you up in case you get those threats. But for other countries, like Ukraine itself, you can't bring a country in if it's in the middle of a war. But there has been much more discussion in Brussels in terms of European Union membership. And I'd say even in Kosovo, Kosovo's stood up immediately and said, hey, we want a permanent US base. Because the base that exists there, Bondsteel, is technically temporary, even though it's been there for 20 years. They want a formal US base independent from the NATO mission and the UN mission. So yeah, we're seeing, I think, increased reliance. It's sort of rejuvenated NATO in some ways. There were a lot of years when people would look at it and go, well, what is this organization for now? Because it was created to counter Russia and they're not around anymore. And, well, yeah, it's given it some sort of new life, I suppose, for good or ill.
There's a couple of questions that are coming in related to putting on your forecasting hat, whether there is a possibility that there could be regime change, or the likelihood that Putin continues this aggression and expands it and maintains control.
I don't have access to any of that information, and I suppose if I did, I wouldn't be allowed to share it with any of you. But yeah, if the question is about like the FSB, for example, which is the main intelligence agency for Russia, domestic intelligence, although they do plenty overseas, there have been some rumblings about how upset they are, about how this has been catastrophically bad for Russia. Not just economically, but I mean, militarily in terms of intelligence. It's been, I talk about the intensity of attacks on civilians, which are very, very serious, but there are estimates of anywhere between 7,000 to 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed just in the past 4 weeks. So, you try to put that in some sort of frame of mind. It's just decimated, these Russian forces. They simply can't maintain that sort of attrition, both in terms of manpower and in terms of material, meaning tanks, aircraft, trucks, logistics. So there must be blowback somewhere, right? I mean, you can't be an authoritarian leader and fail at being the authoritarian military leader. And there are some people who say that because Putin comes from an FSB background, that means that the military doesn't respect him in the same way. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's probably going to be like either 1989 or 1991, where it just happens overnight and then we're all surprised when it happens, even though we're watching for it. Right. So when these things do happen, they happen very quickly. And the point is just to be ready if you're the government when it does.
There's a couple of questions that are asking, is there a way out for Putin? Is there a way for him to save face and get out of this conflict at this point?
Probably not. And a lot, so on the one hand, there are people who are saying, don't give him an off-road. Don't, because, why should he be able to save face for just now trying to destroy an entire country? And the Ukrainian point of view on that is pretty clear, meaning that the Ukrainians were negotiating through the Normandy process, meaning the Minsk agreements and so forth, for about 7 or 8 years. And it was always the same. They kept talking, but they never gave up on their initial demands. They never changed their demands that, hey, you guys got to get out of Donbass and Crimea. They never relented on that. So they're not going to turn back now, right? And Zelensky's been pretty clear about that. So if Ukraine isn't going to back down, then what would be face saving for Putin? And you have to think about his internal psychology too. Right, he was always affected by the loss of the Soviet Union. He's always talked about that and how much that was so tragic for Russia. So I don't see any face-saving way, and probably we shouldn't allow it, because that would be going back on promises made to Ukraine, right? We can't just say, okay, yeah, you'll leave and that'll be fine, and yeah, we'll forget this happened, because too much has happened at this point.
So we only have 3 minutes left before 1. I don't know if you have a couple minutes after, but I think it'd be interesting to turn to a couple of the Alaska questions specifically,
Okay.
which is one, is there a threat to us here? Because as you know, in parts of Alaska, we are very close. We can see Russia from a few places. What are some of the other implications for Alaska, whether it's how we scale up energy production, or I know renewable energy is not your major focus, but other ways that Alaska can be responding to this conflict?
So in terms of direct sort of threats to Alaska, I live in downtown Anchorage, so when the F-22 scramble, I can feel it because the house will shake. You always know when they're off chasing someone versus just routine maneuvers. And yeah, it's in the history of Alaska, right? I mean, this is a strategically important zone. I don't think that Moscow is really too worried about what happens here. This would be more if we get into the worst case scenario of sort of nuclear escalation, then of course Anchorage is not a great place to be. But I wouldn't really worry about it too much in terms of so many of the forces, naval, army, air forces, are being taken out of the Far East military district and being sent to the European district instead. But in terms of what Alaskans can do for energy, I mean, this is something I always talked about in class when I was still teaching at UA. I mean, there are a lot of other resources available. I mean, the Aleutians would, there's endless wind there, isn't there? You become like Denmark overnight. And in terms of the LNG facilities, I know this has been a question that's been raised, and I don't want to feel like I'm tipping my fingers on the scale, but there's always a worry that if you're looking at a $30 billion, conservatively $30 billion investment, that you don't want it to be a stranded asset. You don't want to invest in something that 10 years later isn't going to be worth it because no one's buying liquefied natural gas anymore. And you're having problems at the same time of melting permafrost and your pipelines buckling and all of these sorts of issues. I mean that's what I work on in terms of foresight for Alaska, is often the environmental changes and how it affects infrastructure. So yeah, there is there's the new Ted Stevens Center for Alaska, for Arctic security, that's going to be based here in Alaska. I think that's an important step, because even though all the conflict is taking place over there, there's really increased security concerns for, say, shipping, the northern route opening up. We sort of take our eye off of that, but it's had an effect, as Dr. Hirschberg knows, on the Arctic Council, on Arctic relations, right? Because everyone's been put on pause, quote unquote, because if Russia's chairing that, no one wants to be part of it. So yeah, in the long term, I think we do need to think about what security for Alaska means, and what Arctic security means, because it's not just about energy. It also has to do with fishing, has to do with commercial. The Coast Guard is very worried about what's going to happen here, because the 17th Coast Guard District is massive, and the responsibilities are going to keep increasing. So, how do you balance out, even though we have sort of this European view of what security means right now, the spillover effects could very easily come to Alaska in the coming years. But I'd be happy to, anyone can individually contact me if you want, especially if you have questions about security issues in Alaska. I'm more than happy to talk about that. It can't that's sort of its own course, rather than something I can do a 30-minute piece on. Sorry, 30-second piece on.
We are at a minute past 1 o'clock, and there's a whole bunch of questions we didn't get to, but we asked earlier, and Dr. Briggs has agreed to come back and do another update. So anybody who's on this list, hopefully we will reach out to you, but also keep an eye on the ICER page so that you'll see upcoming webinars related to this topic, but also hopefully another follow on with Dr. Briggs soon. And thank you so much. I learned a lot. I have a lot more questions. Didn't even read my own, and I think this is a conversation we need to keep going into the future. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you, and thank everyone for tuning in.